Thank you so much for coming. This is truly, as I was just talking about it with Marci, Professor Shore, I think all of us can agree that we did not want to do this event. We did not want to have a 4th year anniversary of the war, of the full-scale invasion. Indeed, it's been 12 years since Russia invaded Crimea, and as of dawn today, February 24th, it's been 4 years since the full-scale invasion. I don't have to tell anybody in this room the horror that has been wrought by this event and Russia's aggression, between 400,000 and 1.5 million casualties, $200 billion in infrastructural damage, including 14% of housing costs, as well as unimaginable damage to people's mental health. I mean, I was only in war, full-scale war, Ukraine for about a week, and I simply being woken up every night by air raid sirens for 1 week was enough to drive me get me very stressed out. I can only imagine those who've had to put up with it for much longer. At the same time, I think we can all agree that the war has unearthed or revealed unimaginable strength of Ukrainians, their ability to beat back Russian aggression at the beginning of the war without virtually any foreign assistance or even sort of government action. It was very decentralized, which is truly inspiring to all of us, and the fact that Ukraine has survived this long with relatively small amount of territorial loss. And more broadly, I think for those of us who've spent a lot of time in Ukraine, and I first went to Ukraine, I think in 1989, we've really seen sort of a tremendous cultural change in Ukraine. Now, I mean, when I was there in the 1990s, I can tell you, Ukraine was a lot of things. It was a wonderful place, but it did not have a kind of startup vibe the way it does now. I mean, Ukraine now is just far too hip for someone like me. I'm surprised they still let me in. And the sort of energy and the sort of innovation, really is inspiring. It's not just that they've survived, but the fact that they do that with this sort of élan and creativity, as well as actually, I wanted to say, appreciation for the arts that I think is inspiring to all of us. So to mark this anniversary, we have, I think, no one better you can think of than Professor Marci Shore. Professor Shore got her BA from Stanford University, her master's here in Toronto, PhD from the University of Stanford. She had a stint at Columbia, was a professor of history at Indiana, went to that, I think it's called Yale University, and now is here, which is it's good. I think we're all very excited. She's been a wonderful addition to our community, very active. Her research focuses on the intellectual history of the 20th century and 21st centuries in Central and Eastern Europe. She's had visiting fellows in Vienna. She's the translator of Michal Głowinski's Black Seasons and the author of Caviar and Ashes, A Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918 to 1968, The Taste of Ashes, Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe, and recently, or as of a couple years ago, a new edition of her wonderful book, Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution, was published. She has articles in The New Yorker, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, Yale Review, New York Review of Books, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and she's also, in 2018, she received a Guggenheim Fellowship for a project about the phenomenology in Eastern Europe, tentatively titled In Pursuit of Certainty Lost, Central European Encounters on the Way to Truth. So without further ado, thank you, Marci, and I give the floor to you. And before, just one thing, questions will be written, so you should think of them, and we'll send around cards and hand them out. So.
Okay. Thank you to Lucan and Olga for inviting me. And, I was both, kind of honored and flattered to be invited for this particular occasion, and of course, regretful that this particular occasion exists as an occasion at all. This is not a lecture I ever wanted to give or an occasion I ever wanted to commemorate. And I know I'm not the only person in the room who has that feeling. And so thinking about what I would say tonight, I was thinking a lot about where I was and how I felt 4 years ago. And in those weeks leading up to February 24th, 2022, when we all knew that there were Russian troops building up, hanging out, collecting around the Russian border, but nobody knew exactly, what was going to happen. And I'm a neurotic catastrophist by nature. I mean, I'm both a Jew and I'm a historian of Eastern Europe, so it's overdetermines the neurotic catastrophism. And so I was very, very nervous. But even so, I think I had a kind of block completely taking in what was going to happen. And late in January, when it seemed more and more imminent that something horrific was going to happen, I was messaging with two extraordinary journalist friends, these two women in Ukraine who should be running the world if the world were a just place. Some of you may know Natalia Gumanyuk and Angelina Karyakina, who are just, in contrast to myself, absolutely fearless. And I didn't know what to say. They were there. I was in New Haven, Connecticut. And I sent them just 3 words, and in Russian, I was like, "Ya s vami." I'm just like, "I'm with you," which is an expression in Russian meaning like less physical presence and more solidarity. And Angelina wrote back right away and said, "We are always mobilized and we are ready to work no matter what comes." And I thought, wow, I have never in my life felt ready no matter what comes. But it was the case. I forwarded this message to my brother, and he was also blown away. He's an opera composer in Boston. He said, "Okay, I go everywhere with trail mix and peanut Reese's Pieces. That's as close to ready what comes as I get." And we were all watching. February 24th, 2022 was actually for me, and probably for many of you here, February 23rd. Because 4 a.m., 5 a.m. Kiev time, is actually 9:10 p.m. East Coast time. And so I was entirely too awake and watching the streaming. And there were, I want to start off, I want to eventually get us to a point where we're thinking about time, which is what I want the center of this lecture to be, and I will try not to speak for too long. Academics always try to speak for too long. But I want to start off by sharing a few things that I learned 4 years ago, and I've learned since then. And one of those was, thinking back to that exchange with Natalka and Angelina, who were watching very closely and saying, "We are ready no matter what comes." And my watching very closely and not feeling ready, even though I was on the other side of the world. And then the paralysis, even being on the other side of the world, of watching this full-scale invasion break out. And it reminded me that something that is not a surprise can nonetheless be a shock. We all were watching. It's not as if it came from nowhere, and it's not as if I hadn't expected that something could come. I was working on this piece for the Washington, the Wall Street Journal in like the 10 days beforehand, and the editor kept asking me, she says, "Is Putin going to invade? Is Putin going to invade?" And I said, listen, that is such a vertical system that decision is in the mind of one man, and I have no privileged epistemological access to what's going on in his head. In that sense, your guess is as good as mine. And she said, but you're sure if he invades, the Ukrainians will fight? I said, I'm sure. And she said, how do you know? I said, I just know. And it's not just something I know that other people don't know. I think we all knew. I had no idea what the chances would be, but I knew that if there was an invasion, there was going to be resistance. And so it was not a surprise, but I was still in shock, absolutely paralyzed, and in shock. So that was the first thing I learned, or the first thing was kind of brought back, the difference between surprise and shock. The second thing was this horrific feeling that has only grown since then, as I have looked as well at other horrible things going on around the world, that there is some crisis of the 21st century that we have lost a sense of visceral moral intuition. We should not have to explain to people, why burying children under rubble is evil. Like, that shouldn't require a sophisticated explanation. That shouldn't require an explanation about being heirs to great culture or even an appeal to international law. There should be some immediate moral intuition that burying children under rubble always, everywhere, in every circumstance is evil. And we should be able to feel that before we have some long post-truth-like discussion about it. And I thought something has happened in the world that we've lost an immediate intuition, that there's a lot of talking, and that somehow that initial visceral response is not universal in the way it needs to be universal. The third thing I learned was, or I thought about a lot, was an occasion to go back to one of my very favorite, if not my favorite philosopher, which is Lev Shestov, who, if you haven't read Lev Shestov, everyone should go home and read Lev Shestov, who was let's call him a Jewish existentialist from Kiev, born in 1866. And he was already a kind of important character in my phenomenology book. He's one of Husserl's most important interlocutors. I promise I will not bore you with that tonight. That gets a little bit obscure. But he's somebody who, when I was in Kiev during bombing, I went back and reread because I was half a mile from where he grew up, suddenly in a bomb shelter in his neighborhood in a world that he couldn't have imagined. And one of the things that Shestov writes about so poignantly is the irreducibility of suffering, of every individual act of suffering, of every individual instance of suffering. That pain is something that can't be scaled and compared. It's not a competition. It's not something that can be sublated or dialectically overcome or used in some kind of Hegelian way to justify a higher purpose. That suffering needs to be recognized in its irreducibility in each individual instance. Which again seems like it should be an obvious point, but is something I think we've lost an appreciation for. There are many reasons to go back to Shestov. That's just one of them. And then the fourth thing, which is related to the past 2 points, is simply the difficulty of seeing what is in front of us. And this is a phenomenological point, but I promise I will not bore you with Husserl right now. When in those first days after February 24th, I was talking to a lot of journalists, many more journalists than I normally talk to, because of course that journalists were calling all the East Europeanists, to try to figure out what was going on. And one of the questions that came up again and again, for understandable reasons, is how is this different from World War II? What is different? Of course, you can spend hours and hours talking about what's similar and what's different. But one of the things I found myself mentioning in the first place was the internet. We're watching this all in real time. And there are, to this day, debates among historians about when did the news of the Holocaust first reach the West. When was that? Who first communicated it? Who first listened to it? When did it penetrate? When did it spread? When was it accepted? Now it's like we have a live stream into the gas chambers. Now we see everything in real time. Now we watch people killed all the time, in my own country as well. We just sat and watched guys in masks, federal agents fire 3 bullets, into the heads of a 37-year-old American woman, on a suburban street. We watch it in real time. And the fact that we're seeing it doesn't seem to be preventing it from happening. It had been that the logic was if people knew, this would make it stop. But no, now we watch children starve to death, children buried under rubble, people shot on the streets, and it doesn't make it stop. And not only does it not make it stop, but it's not clear to me that it hasn't made our gaze hazier. Like, what needs to be done to actually shake people, shake us into seeing what is right in front of us? And this difficulty of seeing, which was a phenomenological problem, I also became very preoccupied with. And one of the things I went back and reread, who also everyone else should reread or read for the first time, was Nadezhda Mandelstam's memoirs, Hope Against Hope in English, where she's writing about herself and her husband during the Stalinist purges. And describing her life during the Stalinist terror, one of the things that she says is, to look life directly in the face is very difficult. This was clearly a minimalist formulation. One of the things that Husserl's young assistant said before the First World War was, we know how grueling it is to truly learn to see. What needs to happen for us to actually see what is happening right in front of us? And how can we be shaken into that? A lot of 20th century philosophy was about being shaken into truly seeing. This was what phenomenology was about. It was also about what Viktor Shklovsky's, the Russian formalist, idea of defamiliarization or estrangement was about. Poetic language was supposed to make the familiar strange in such a way as to wake you up into seeing it. This was what the German philosopher Karl Jasper's idea of the Grenzsituation, the limit experience, the border experience, the boundary experience, the experience on the margins of human extremity, that those moments that shake people and drive them to philosophy, that shake them into seeing. This is what Lev Shestov was also preoccupied with. He felt like reason is all well and good for these middle realms of human existence, but at the border, at the extremity, reason fails, and we need something else. But one of the things I felt, and maybe Lucan can speak to this as well, is that over the past 4 years, wandering around the States and wandering around Europe, I've somehow felt like, oh my God, everybody is sleepwalking. Nobody is actually seeing like the thing that's right in front of them. And one of the things that keeps drawing me back to Ukraine, even though in general I'm a complete neurotic coward and I'm not brave at all, but one of the reasons I keep going there is that the seduction of being in the place where people actually are not sleepwalking. This feeling, like sometimes I feel like Kiev is the only European capital where people are not sleepwalking, where people are actually seeing and experiencing what's going on. And so this question of, is there something epistemologically privileged about this Grenzsituation, this limit experience, this limit situation, that gives people insight that they don't have in the habituation of the everyday. There are moments when I just feel like the thinking in Ukraine is so much sharper than it is everywhere else, and it's this intellectual draw. And I don't think that's arbitrary, and I don't think it's genetic. I think there's an experience happening that is shaking people into seeing in a way that most of the time, most of us are not actually seeing. So those are just some lessons. Now I want to go on to some questions that have preoccupied me, which I have in no way been able to answer since this full-scale invasion. I'm going to end with this problem of time. The first three are related to the second of two famous accursed Russian questions. The first is "Что делать?" What is to be done? And the second is "Кто виноват?" Who is to blame? And on this, the note of the question of who is to blame or what is to blame, I have been preoccupied, and not myself alone, with the problem of evil. Rethinking what the problem of evil. Where does the problem of evil come from? I've made all my students go back and read or reread, Eichmann in Jerusalem and think about, where does evil come from? I've also started obsessively going back to Faust. Under what circumstances do people sell their souls to the devil? After it was exactly a year ago, when I was in this room, listening to my colleague give this great talk on this macabre occasion, when Zelensky had that grotesque Oval Office meeting with Trump and Vance. And afterwards, Lindsey Graham said on television, he said, "Donald Trump has just given us a master class in putting America first." And I rage tweeted back at him. And my husband always tells me not to rage tweet, and I'm sure he's right about that. I rage tweeted back at him. I said, "No, Donald Trump has just given us a master class in moral nihilism. And Lindsey Graham has just given us a master class in selling your soul to the devil." I understand Trump has no moral compass. There's no reason to even think about a moral compass. Lindsey Graham knew and knows he's doing something bad. He knows he's gone over to the dark side. So I'm looking at all these people, thinking okay, where does evil come from? Where does sadism come from? Where does this performative cruelty that seems to be a new trend come from? Where do these Faustian bargains come from? Under what circumstances do people decide to sell their souls to the devil? And I've been obsessively going back to Faust and toying with teaching this seminar on fictional and non-fictional versions of Faust, which I may subject the monk school students to, if I decide I can't resist that. The other question is related and has to do with violence. And this is something that I was first inspired, or let's say inspired seems a little too cheerful, provoked to think about by the feminist in Belarus, who did, and do remarkable things. And watching them from afar, in August, September, and that fall of 2020, and how they conceived of this revolution and how they conceived of resistance. One of the things I learned from my Belarusian friends and colleagues was that a language they had developed to speak about the problem of domestic violence in the most literal family everyday sense became a language for the whole society to talk about how they were being treated by a tyrannical regime. And that really got me thinking about the relationship between domestic violence and political tyranny. It got me thinking about the role of habituation to violence. Violence as habitus. It's one of the things I've been thinking about a lot in relation to Russia. My brilliant sociologist friend in Vienna, Anna Shor-Chudnovskaya, who grew up in Soviet Kiev, has long worked in the German-speaking world. She's very interested in monitoring this threshold of sensitivity that she felt like Putin had been systematically, over a period of years, cultivating a desensitivity to violence, cultivating an acceptance to violence, cultivating a society that accepted violence as simply a normal language with which you related to other people. So I've been thinking a lot about that as well. And how do you get these, 20-year-old Russian kids who are sent across the border, not knowing why they're really there, who are tying to boards and torturing with electric shocks these middle-aged women who could be their mothers, who speak their own language? Where does that come from? Where does that idea that violence is just some means by which you relate to other people as if it were a kind of everyday normal thing? So I've been thinking about that. Not very cheerful, I know. Third thing, I've been thinking about the role of post-truth. I work on intellectual history, so I work a lot on the history of ideas, the history of philosophy, the intellectual history of totalitarianism. And when people say, what is the biggest difference between, if we call it neo-totalitarianism or neo-fascism or fascism or whatever we're calling it, between what we see in Trumpism and Putinism, and what we saw, in the 20th century, it's this post-truth, postmodern twist. There's no longer a single coherent narrative. Now there's an undermining of the notion that there is any such thing as truth at all. And another author I always go back to, Victor Klemperer, who I'm sure many of you know, who was a German Jewish philologist who survives in Nazi Germany, thanks largely to his non-Jewish wife, and takes meticulous notes during the Second World War, on the language of Nazism, and the language of, his own language, as it gets changed by Nazism. And he's a philologist, and he knows the French Enlightenment and he knows German Romanticism, so he has all these very sharp insights about the particular ways the words are working. And he talks about this idea of Entgrenzung, this dismantling of borders, of being a characteristic of Nazism and Nazi language. You get rid of borders. You get rid of limits. And I feel like that's also a key to understanding what's happening now. Like the border between truth and lies gets effaced. The border between truth and falsehood, between reality and non-reality. Suddenly, Trump can generate kind of AI fantasy of, ethnic cleansing via beach casino resorts in Gaza, and throw it out to the world as if that were real. So you get rid of the borders between truth and falsehood, between reality and non-reality, between the human and the non-human, between life and death. It's that hot mic that Putin and Xi had in China where they start talking about immortality. These guys, don't believe in death. They think they're going to live forever. And then Peter Thiel has his body cryonically, preserved to be resuscitated. And, Elon Musk wants to go to Mars. I'm like, if there's no more border between life and death, then life loses any weight. And so I'm thinking about this idea of Entgrenzung, this dismantling of borders, this dismantling of boundaries. Because once you have no border between life and death, real and not real, human, not human, truth and falsehood, there's no basis for a distinction between good and evil. That's all just kind of gone through our fingers. It also reminds me, and Irina Shcherbakova spoke about this from Memorial at the Havel Human Rights Conference last year. She said it's like the witches in Macbeth. Putin comes into power on the principle that the witches in Macbeth articulate: fair is foul and foul is fair. And there's no longer a distinction between good and evil. Hover through the fog and the filthy air. That there's some kind of boundary between good and evil has gone away. And then you're really in this Dostoevskian world in which everything is permissible. So this refusal to acknowledge boundaries. Surkov, comes up, Putin's spin doctor, number one, comes up and says, the Russian world has no borders. And the implications of this statement obviously transcend the geographical. There are no boundaries. There's no sense of any kind of limit. And this seems to throw us into a kind of nihilism that is a bit distinct, I think, from what we saw in Stalinism or Nazism, in the sense of there's no real telos, there's no end goal, there's no utopian vision at the end of it. I mean, I remember in the 1990s when I was a graduate student and the archives were opening, one of the senior historians said, the big secret we find out when we finally get in about the communist, when we finally get into the Stalinist archives, the communists were really communist. There was a vision. Now we're just in this nihilist abyss. My philosopher friend Konstantin Sigov in Kiev said in an interview he gave last year in French, he said, what's going on in Russia is nihilism made systemic, which feels to me like not a bad description of what's happened in Russia. So the fourth thing I want to talk about is of this question about about time. My fourth question is about time. And how this Grenzsituation, this Grenzerfahrung, this limit experience changes temporality. And how this war functions as a kind of tear in time. Of course, historians are always interested in time. We work in time. Things always happen in order. Time always goes in one direction. In German, people spoken about 1989 as die Wende, like the turn. Time had turned, and then that was supposed to lead us to the end of history. That was the narrative at the time. And in the 1990s, running around, first former Czechoslovakia and then Poland, people kept saying, after 1968 in Czechoslovakia, it was like time stopped. It was like there were 20 years and time didn't move at all. It just stayed in the same place. And then suddenly there was acceleration. There was this leapfrogging. And then there was deceleration, but a directionality remained. There was still, for a very long time, a sense that in the Fukuyama-esque way that we were moving towards the end of history, which was, ultimately there's no alternative to liberal democracy, so we're all, going to get there, maybe some of us slower, some of us faster, but we're all kind of on that path. And I think the moment that first made me think, like, no, something else has happened, was the Maidan in 2013 to 2014. That brought back a new language that reminded me of a language that had existed among dissidents before 1989. And Gleb Pavlovsky, who was another one of Putin's key spin doctors, who becomes remorseful at a certain point and breaks away and is no longer alive. Not because Putin killed him, but he died after a serious illness not long after the full-scale invasion. But he had broken with Putin around 2011. And then watching the Maidan, he was from Odessa. He was also a Ukrainian speaker, as well as a Russian speaker. He said, in January 2014, watching the Maidan, I understood what it is that I was seeing before my eyes. I was seeing the real live process of a revolution, which I never thought I would see in my life. And that's what I saw that my friends in Poland who were veterans of Solidarity saw. They were seeing the thing they never thought they would see a second time in their lifetimes. And I was also completely captivated. And that was a moment that got me thinking about time, because anecdotally, so many of my friends and colleagues who were taking part in that revolution started talking to me about time. I'm sure not just to me, they were talking about time in general, and about how they were losing track of time. And it became a kind of very common collective experience for people on the Maidan, out there in that square in the center of Kiev, that they were losing track of time, that people would try to tell a story and they would say, I can't remember, was that this morning? Was it yesterday? Was it last week? I can't remember anymore. And it seemed to have something to do with the fact that the boundary between night and day was getting effaced. Suddenly you could call anyone at any time of day, and that was, true whether you were 15 or whether you were 75. There was no longer such a thing as things shutting down at night. So the border between night and day getting effaced, people losing track of time, not knowing how much time had passed, time moving in a different way. And I became preoccupied with this, and I forced all my students at Yale then to read lots of comparative analyses of the philosophy of time. We read Bergson, we read Husserl, we read Sartre, we read Heidegger. Everyone had to try to come to terms with the problem of time. And what you see if you jump into the problem of time is that the problem of time is really a problem of the present. Nobody knows what to do with the present. The past has a certain clarity, and the future has a certain clarity in terms of what it is. But no one can grasp the present, because as soon as you try to take hold of it, it's gone. It kind of slips through your fingers. I was then talking to my physicist brother-in-law about this, He works on clean energy and plasma physics, which is something about which I know nothing. And he said, well, Marci, in physics, we have a t equals 0, but it's really just it's a construct. Really, the present doesn't exist. There is no t equals 0. Time has always passed. Time is always moving. But what came to feel very resonant to me looking at the Maidan and trying to understand the idea of time was Sartre's idea of time, where the present was a border. The present was the border between the past and the future, which was for him the border between the en soi and the pour soi. The en soi was being in itself and the pour soi being for itself, which doesn't really mean anything unless you've jumped into this ridiculous Hegelian language. But what Sartre meant by this is that the en soi, the in itself, was facticity. It is what has already happened, what has already been and cannot be changed, who you have been up to this moment, that is now inert and fixed. And the pour soi, which is associated with the future, and Sartre associates it with transcendence, is the possibility of going beyond what has been. And the present is the moment of crossing that border from facticity to transcendence, from the in itself to the for itself, from the en soi to the pour soi, from what has been and cannot be changed to the possibility of something new. And of course, that border is with us every moment of every day. But in ordinary circumstances, we don't notice it. We sleepwalk, And revolution shakes people into seeing that border like you suddenly cast a blinding light on something. The present as that moment where you have the chance to go beyond. The present as this moment of radical decisionism, and this being shaken into awareness of that radical decisionism. So I'm going to now jump back in the last few minutes to February 24, 2022, which then brought an even more decisive end to the end of history, and a new kind of a tear in time. There are certain historical moments where you can feel time tear, as if the abyss starts opening between what had happened 5 minutes ago and where you are now, and there's no going back. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke of a Zeitenwende. The Germans can kind of smush words together and so the Wende was turn, and now he kind of adds Zeiten, and it's like a turn in time. But despite his declaration that this was now a turn in time, it just seemed to me that outside of Ukraine, Germans and other Europeans continued to sleepwalk. The Ukrainian art curator Vasyl Cherepanyn was writing as the Russian army was shelling Ukrainian cities. He said, the West has always been too late. Stanislav Asayev, the Ukrainian writer who survived nearly 3 years in a torture camp in Donetsk and then went to fight on the front, wrote recently about this idea of being too early or too late. And he starts off an essay that he just wrote for a German collection. He says, he's thinking about Nietzsche's madman, who is always too early, or in any case, not on time. Or Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which begins, with "it's too early." The man who will understand what I have to say has not yet been born. Nietzsche was called Friedrich the Unzeitgemäßig, the untimely one. And Stanislav Asayev, who's still quite young, and he's in his mid-30s, he said, on the contrary, he fears that he's already too late, that the time for his reflections about this war has passed, that the people who could understand him have already disappeared or are disappearing. And he lost almost his entire unit fighting in the front. He was one of very few people who survived in 2024. I was working on this essay about Chestov at the time, and I'll tell a little unexpected anecdote. I was working on this essay about Chestov, and I wanted to work on it in dialogue with Stash because he is the most Chestovian of contemporary writers. And he was, he had survived almost 3 years in gruesome captivity. He wrote an extraordinary memoir about it. He was repeatedly tortured. And then he volunteered, he mobilized, he went to the front. And I was texting him on the front, and asking him, if you want to talk about Chestov, and he's in a trench. He's in a trench with a machine gun, and he's like, unfortunately, I don't really have time right now. I'm sorry, I'm a complete idiot. Of course, you don't have time to talk about Chekhov while you're like in a trench. And then a little while later, he wrote back and he's like, actually, maybe I do want to talk about Chekhov. And so, we're texting about Chekhov, and he sends me this very dense paragraph about, the ontology of the Russian soul. And I already was like fooling around with how I was going to translate into English in my mind. And then he sends me back 20 minutes later another message, and he's like, Nas kak raz okružají. He's like, they've just surrounded us. And I understood he was saying goodbye. I understood that he didn't think he was going to survive. And fortunately he did. I mean, he was wounded, and evacuated, covered in blood. But he was one of few people from his unit who did survive. And now he's like, okay, I'm supposed to go back to being an intellectual. What can I say, and who cares? And does it even have any meaning that we say anything? And maybe the people who could understand me are already gone. So with that set up, I want to spend a couple minutes just thinking about the present, and how we can grasp the present, at this moment of a gran situation. And I went back thinking again about time to Hannah Arendt's idea of, the present, again, as this gap between the past and the future, not just a border, but actually a gap, a kind of a space. And Hannah Arendt, in the gap between past and future, draws on this parable that Kafka writes. And in the parable, there's an anonymous he who is in the present. And the present is being crushed by the war between the past and the future. But the past is not a force pulling him back to the past. And the future is not a force pulling him forward to the future. Instead, both are crushing in on the present. This past, does not pull back, Arendt writes, but presses forward. And on the contrary to what one would expect, the future drives us back into the past. Seen from the viewpoint of man who always lives in the interval between past and future, time is not a continuum, a flow of uninterrupted succession. It is broken in the middle. And this place that is broken in the middle is always going to be a battlefield and can never really be a home. So I want to think for just a moment about that present as a battlefield, kind of existentially and temporally and also literally. And how is it possible to grasp this interval in time being crushed by the past and the future as it is happening? Serhiy Zhadan just gave a wonderful speech at the Munich Security Conference about time and about how war fractures time. It breaks the continuity. It alienates the past from the present, and the future may or may not exist. And so I was juxtaposing what Serhiy was writing with what Arendt was writing about this moment of insight as an interval, or the present as an interval in time at certain extreme moments, which is altogether determined by things that are no longer and by things that are not yet. And Stanislav Asayev goes on after he says that the people who could have understood him are no longer alive, and he says, how do I even explain what I've been doing in the past year? I was in the trenches, I was on the front, I was wounded twice, and then I demobilized, and what did I do when I demobilized? Well, Assad was overthrown in Syria, and I went to Syria to visit Sednaya prison because I wanted to see a place that was like the place where I was. He was in Izolatia, in Donetsk, for almost 3 years. And so this idea of being in this hell, this facility that was designed to torture people, he said, I have to see it. I have to be there. And he goes to Sednaya, and he says, what was I doing there? Why am I looking there? Well, I can't be one of these intellectuals sitting at the table, thinking that we can talk about everything as if we're in Habermas's paradigm of communicative reason, because reason has broken down. Whatever this moment is teaching us, it's not something that can be resolved from reason. And, Arendt was writing about this moment when you have a chance to grasp something new, is this this moment of appeal to thought that can arise in the odd in-between period, which sometimes, she says, inserts itself into historical time, when not only the later historians, but also the actors and witnesses, the living themselves, become aware of an interval in time which is altogether determined by things that are no longer and by things that are not yet. In history, these intervals have shown more than once that they may contain the moment of truth. And so I'm wondering whether this could be some chance, some desperate chance for a moment of truth, which is all the more poignant in a post-truth world where we've all lost a sense that truth actually exists. That the past has brought us to the present, but the past is no longer. And that no longer feels more extreme than it does at other time. Journalists keep asking me, especially with respect to America and to the United States, can we go back? And I always say, no, we can't go back. There's not going back. There's no going back, but that doesn't mean there can't be a coming out on the other side. That doesn't mean there can't be a going forward. And this is what Serhii Žadan talks about with reference to Ukraine a week ago in Munich. He says, the future will certainly not resemble the past. And we have to, it's a mistake for us to think about the future as something that could possibly resemble the past. That doesn't mean that the future can't be good, he says, but it can't be compared to what was. The past has been irreversibly, he says, and categorically destroyed by this war. The strategy of waiting out the present as a forced pause is wrong. The notion of the future as an opportunity to simply return to what was is wrong. The future as a deferred version of the past is an illusion. So since there is no going back, only forward, I just want to spend the last couple minutes trying to say something positive by thinking about a coming out of the other side, and what Ukrainian reconstruction could possibly be, not only for Ukraine, but for all of us. And if this could be some moment of extracting meaning amidst nihilism. So I'm just going to throw out a couple of my, wild and crazy ideas for Ukraine after the victory, as the avant-garde. Ukraine should be rebuilt in clean energy. Everyone has to get off Russian gas and oil. Everyone should get off gas and oil. The infrastructure should be rebuilt in clean energy. It should be the cutting edge of rehabilitation and prosthetics. It should be the very best technology and development, in how to help people who have been disabled by the war. There should be the very best and the very newest and the most innovative reconstruction of infrastructure to make it accessible for everybody who has been disabled by this war, to make it inclusive on a level that we haven't yet experienced. There should be an open conversation, about PTSD, about treatment, about mental health, about all of these things that were buried for the generations who went through Nazism and Stalinism, and it's only now we start talking about intergenerational trauma and how this could be at the root of the pathology that is current Russian society. Like, this could be the moment, that becomes something that is no longer taboo on a very wide scale. Serhii Žadan said in Munich, he said, it's the past we tend to idealize. And my last plea here is that for Ukraine as it's reconstructed has to be reconstructed if we are going to have any chance of saving our terribly mutilated world on the basis of truth. There's going to be a tremendous temptation to mythologize. There's going to be a tremendous temptation to project a kind of moral clarity, and black and white between good and evil that people have experienced in their own skin in the near past into the distant past. It's going to be very hard to resist that. It's going to be very hard to remember that what will give people credibility and what will give us a ground to stand on is not belonging to a nation that has been innocent since time immemorial, because there is no such nation and there is no such people. It's an illusion. You know, as Serhi says, it's the past we tend to idealize. This resistance to mythologizing, you know, a taking responsibility for telling the truth. The Ukrainian novelist Victoria Amelina, who I know many of you know, who was extraordinarily brave, who, you know, left her career as a novelist and left her young child in Poland to do war crimes research as soon as the full-scale invasion broke out, was killed in an attack in Kramatorsk in 2023. And one of her last texts before she was killed was something she wrote in Krasnogruda in Poland, a place that's very special to me, and was one of the few texts she wrote in English. It was an essay, and it's called "Nothing Bad Ever Happened Here." And she wrote about Lviv, which was her hometown, and what it means to live and grow up and inhabit a city that is right in the center of what my husband named the Bloodlands, where there has been one tragedy and calamity, you know, and atrocity after another, and cruelties performed by one group upon another group upon another group. And she said, what does it mean to live in this place that's haunted? Well, she says, we break the spell not when we banish the ghost, but when we invite them to breakfast. A true home is a place where you have neighbors you know by name. This includes those who were killed and those who helped kill them, those who survived and those who risked their families' lives to rescue the hunted. And this, to me, is a kind of posthumous gift that Vika left us. This call by somebody whose patriotic commitment to Ukraine can never be doubted, who gave her life to her country with extraordinary bravery, saying, we have to face the past, you know, including bad things we did, with eyes wide open. And so my hope in conclusion is that Ukraine, tyranny will be defeated, you know, both in Russia and on this side of the Atlantic, that Ukraine will give up on this idea of catching up with the West, because the West has crashed, you know, and has proven vulnerable to fascism just like everybody else. None of us has some special genetic immunity. That the end of history turned out not to work. The whole paradigm, which ironically was also a Stalinist paradigm, we're going to catch up and overtake the West, we're going to catch up and overtake America. Well, it was also a 1990s, you know, liberal teleology of progress, we're all going to catch up. That has to be over. Ukraine has to be the new avant-garde. It has to be much better, and it has to be different. There's no going back. We need a paradigm shift. We need a break with the past. We need to embrace that past. Ukraine needs to be the avant-garde, and the truth needs to be the grounding with which we move forward. The future needs to be grounded on truth. And then maybe we have a chance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really thought-provoking. So we have a few questions. I encourage you to write more. In the meantime, I'm going to start off with this question, which is about sort of where evil comes from. I think this war has made a lot of us think about the sources of evil, as you've mentioned. And so one view of where evil comes from Stanley Milgram, who did these experiments in the early 60s where he had random folks inflict shocks on people they did not know for some sort of very arbitrary reason. And what he found out was that basically everybody inflicts those shocks. That basically the answer to where evil is it's everywhere. That everybody is basically capable of evil, and that's something sort of, I think, is sort of an assumption that I think I normally share. But then there's another view, which I think, you know, is that evil is more prevalent in certain cultures and countries than in others. namely, and I think of Russia here, and I think at the beginning of the war, I was one of those people, hardcore cosmopolitan, who resisted efforts to sort of link the invasion to Russian culture or Russian society and the like. But I think as it went along and as I sort of was confronted with the fact that many of my friends, now former friends in Moscow, supported the war, and seeing sort of the apparent lack of resistance among Russians to the war, I've begun to kind of find myself kind of inching in the direction of sort of seeing kind of evil as partly rooted in more prevalent in some cultures than in others. So I'm just wondering sort of where is evil?
No, I have been making my students reread Stanley Milgram as well. No, that's also something I've. So for those of you who don't know the Milgram experiment, it was inspired by the Adolf Eichmann trial. It was from the 60s, and should we go through the experiment, or does everyone know the?
He wants we could torture yourself.
Okay. And it was conducted at Yale, so I feel I wasn't. It was before my time. It was before I was born, but. The idea was that volunteers for the experiment were told to draw straws to see whether they would be the teacher or the learner in an experiment that was ostensibly designed to teach about the effect of punishment on learning. And so the learner had to memorize pairs of words, and the teacher had to administer an electric shock every time there was a mistake, at increasing levels of intensity. And the question that the researchers were asking was, when would the teachers stop administering the shocks? Like, at what point of inflicting pain on other people would they stop this? Now, let me say, no one actually got any shocks. The learners were confederates of the experimenters, and this was a setup, and nobody was physically abused. But the original assumptions that the researchers had was that only the very odd, occasional sadist would keep administering these electric shocks up to the point of devastating pain, if not death. And most people just keep going. And so they've controlled for any kind of personal animus, right? Because it's all randomized. They don't know the learner. They have no reason to like or dislike this person. There's nothing in the situation that would cause them to feel some kind of animus or antagonism. So there's a completely neutral relationship. And yet, and there's no reason they can't leave. They're not being forced to stay. When they express discomfort, the scientists would just say, well, the experiment requires you to continue. But they're not coerced in any way. They could get up and walk out of the room. They're in a room at Yale University. They're not in a prison. But this terrifying finding is that most people defer to authority. And of course, this is the kind of experiment that cannot be repeated because, those people were traumatized enough, and now there are like things like restrictions slapped down on what you can do with human subjects. But that remains with us. And I think that's certainly one instance. There are that kind of banality. The people who are going along with things who have no particular reason whatsoever. But then I wonder, are there different categories? Just like the people who have no moral sensibility versus the people like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham who know they're doing something wrong, but have made this pact with the devil. So there are the people who, we have this, reign of watching the Trump Gaza video, among other things. We have a kind of performative sadism now trend, going on. Not just, we have, Kristi Noem doing these, erotic video ops in front of these torture prisons in El Salvador with people crammed like sardines behind her, as if, this is sexy. So we have there's there's the taking pleasure, in doing evil. Is that one category of person? And then there's just the conformity going along with it. Then there's you've sold your soul to the devil for some kind of advantage, and what kind of self-interest might you have, and how do we, I've been trying to figure out how these categories fit together. Let me just mention about Russia. We've all been tearing our hair out about Russia. One of the really interesting things that just came out, I should send this to you, Lucan, The sociologist from Kiev, who's long been based in Vienna, Anna Shortchudovskaya, who I mentioned, she and a colleague at the Sigmund Freud University in Vienna did a study recently analyzing thousands of essays written by teenagers in the framework of an essay contest that went on for years, run by Memorial, asking Russian teenagers, adolescents, to write about victims of Stalinist repression in their families, in their communities, in their schools, to do research, to try to understand the story, to uncover some of their own history. And Anna was analyzing this. She actually just wrote like a short op-ed version for this anniversary, which I can, in German, which I can send people if you're interested. But the really interesting finding was that the problem wasn't that the young Russians didn't understand the subjectivity of the victims. They had a lot of empathy, actually, for the victims. The problem was that they had no sense of the subjectivity of the perpetrators. The victims were real people, and you felt sorry for them. But the fact that the perpetrators also had some agency, that these were crimes carried out by people who had to actually carry them out, like that became very vague and metaphysical. And this very much kind of confirmed research she had been doing as a sociologist doing interviews in Russia, until several years ago when it was no longer safe for her to go back to Russia. But I remember her coming back not long after the Maidan from doing research in Russia and asking her respondents, well, how can something like Stalinist terror be prevented from happening again? And when she got back to Vienna, she said, Marci, not only did they not have an answer, they didn't understand the question. She said, for them, Stalinist terror was, she used the phrase in German, it was like Naturgewalt. It was like a violent act of nature. It was like a tsunami. You can't stop an earthquake. You can't stop the rain from coming. Best case scenario, you have an umbrella in the closet. But I did feel like that might be some key to understanding what's happening in Russia. Like why this crisis of subjectivity. There was a really good piece that Tanya Ogarkova and Volodya Yermolenko wrote on crime without punishment, punishment without crime, both in Russian culture and in Russian society. And they said there are two categories of people in Russia. There are these untouchable kind of Übermenschen. Hey, my favorite kids are leaving here. They're escaping. They listen to me talk too much. There are these categories of the oligarchs, and the Übermenschen and the people who can commit any kind of grotesque crime with total impunity because there is no law and there's no accountability. And then there are the masses of people who are subject to what in Russian is called произвол, this kind of arbitrariness, who anything can be done to them and they can be punished for anything or nothing at any given moment. And in both cases, there's no responsible subjectivity. In both cases, there's no sense of a relationship between a subject taking responsibility for action and being treated accordingly. So this crisis of subjectivity, I feel like, is somehow at the center of things in Russia. But how we resolve that is, but maybe you have an idea.
Oh yeah, I have all the answers. So I guess relatedly, so what is what do you think is the culpability of regular Russians in this war?
Yeah, this is like the $1 million question. I think about this all the time because I also think about this as an American, right? Because I know how I felt and how I feel. How I felt during the first administration, the moment when I realized that the Trump administration was taking kids away from their parents on the U.S.-Mexican border and locking them in cages. And I grew up in a Jewish community. I grew up with Holocaust survivors. I grew up with these stories of parent-child separation. I grew up with the sense of the Germans being implicated. And I thought, we are all implicated in this. This is like, I'm also paying taxes to this government that is using that money, to take a 3-year-old who has just escaped across the desert, away from his mother and lock them in a cage. So I don't feel in any kind of position of moral superiority. And I understand I'm very empathetic to the Ukrainians, saying all the Russians are culpable. I think in some ways we are all implicated in the societies of which we're a part. And what it means to live in a totalitarian society is to be implicated in it. Now, what we do with that, that's the question. I just watched the documentary Mr. Nobody against Putin. And I was very touched. So this is a story of, in this, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's this small rundown town somewhere, with the name of the town I'm forgetting. And it's this guy in his 30s who works at a school. And he's like he runs he's the videographer, he documents after school activities, he's some kind of a teacher. He's young, he lives alone, he doesn't seem to have his own family. He spends a lot of time with the students, he's very attached to the school, it's a little town where he grew up. And then, after the full-scale invasion starts, the school starts becoming militarized, and there are more propaganda exercises that are supposed to be done, and he's charged with orchestrating some of these and filming them. And he starts kind of keeping an archive, and then eventually is going to kind of smuggle this out to a filmmaker in Europe who he meets on Instagram. I mean, you watch this guy just send an email to this guy who's looking for footage on Instagram. And you're like, are you crazy? He's clearly, he got extremely lucky that he managed actually to get out with this footage. But the interesting thing, you're watching this and you're like, okay, totally ordinary guy, with this ordinary job at school. Where does he get this moral clarity from? He's not thinking of himself as a hero. He's not anticipating being a hero. He doesn't have romantic fantasies. But he has this moral clarity. And he understands from the beginning something is going on that is wrong. And that it's worth taking risk, to tell the world that this is wrong. And around him, there are people, some of whom are gung-ho about it, some of whom are uneasy, but they're going along with it, some of whom are indifferent. So what is it? What is it that makes that distinction? And I was wondering, there's a point in the beginning of the movie where he's talking about how he always felt kind of alienated and he felt kind of different. And there seems like there's a vague allusion to sexual orientation, but it's not really clear. And I started wondering about the epistemological and the moral advantages of marginality. One thing my husband Tim had found when he was working on Bloodlands, digging up these cases of who rescued people, who saved Jews, who took risk. And this can't be proven on a kind of large-scale study, but anecdotally, it started seeming that a disproportionate number of people who, when society breaks down, maintained a moral clarity, were able to take risk, were somehow marginalized. Either they were members of some religious group that was not very popular, or they were homosexuals, or they were somehow somewhat outside society in such a way that when society goes in an evil direction, they somehow are maintaining some kind of clarity, which it made me think of Isaac Deutscher's essay, The Non-Jewish Jew, which is about the epistemological advantages of being on the margins. And it made me wonder, is there a moral advantage to being on the margins? To being a little, is there... Because this guy was just amazing. I was watching it with my 15-year-old son, and he was just he's not generally that easily moved, but he was very moved, by this teacher. What do you think about, that's also the question of how much courage can you expect other people to have? I feel no moral superiority because I'm not a courageous person. If you go out and protest, you'll be thrown in prison. I wouldn't be willing to go to prison. But then, of course, you run into collective action problems as well. Early on, after the full-scale invasion, I was talking to a Ukrainian colleague, and I said, what would it take for there to be a revolution in Russia? And he said, Marci, 2 million people in the streets of Moscow, it's over tomorrow. I said, Vlad, how do you know it's 2 million? Is 1.9 million not enough? 500 people go out in the streets, they arrest 500. 5,000 go out, they arrest 5,000. How do you know when you get to the tipping point? You need a critical mass of people crossing to the other side of fear at the same time. How do you, you're the social scientist. How do you get that?
Well, it's very easy. Right. So, I don't have an answer to that question, but I will ask you more questions. So what lessons have been learned in the last 4 years for Democrats, for autocrats? How
For Democrats, for autocrats, well, the autocrats seem to be winning. I just keep thinking, like, when do we get to the part in the movie when the good guys start winning? Like, shouldn't it be that time where we get to the part in the movie where the good guys start winning? I mean, clearly the attempt to flatter, to cajole, to not provoke has not worked. And that, my gut feeling, is that we've been way too wimpy, and I can't, so I not only grew up in a Jewish community with my great-grandparents were pogrom victims at the hands of Ukrainians. I grew up in a community in which anything German was anathema. And I was a teenage peace activist. I went to Abby Hoffman's memorial service wearing peace sign earrings and a tie-dye t-shirt. And now, as a middle-aged Jewish mother, I go to Washington and I go to Germans and I plead with them to immediately send lethal weapons to Ukrainians. Like, this was not a position I could have imagined myself being in. And I kind of feel like I got here without actually having any radical change of values at all. Like, I kind of feel like I'm the same person. But I don't see any other way. I miss speaking Russian. I love Russian. I still teach Dostoevsky. I miss going to Russian. Like, I still have all of this Russophilism. And I feel like if we even care about Russians at all, the best thing to do is to ensure that the Ukrainians completely, decisively defeat this regime and bring it down, because Putin will bleed through his entire population until he's defeated. And not only does he not care about Ukrainian lives, he clearly doesn't care about Russian lives at all, which gives him an incredible advantage. Because if no one else's life means anything to you, then you really have a free hand. Then there are no constraints. So I feel like we should have given the Ukrainians everything, like from the very beginning. Which I thought, I'm like, what is this dribbling out of, like, you can have 3 tanks, but you can't have 4 tanks? I mean, not that I know anything about military anything. I mean, I know nothing about military, but okay, well, you can shoot over here, but you can't actually shoot the launching sites because that's on the other side. I'm like, this has to be over. Like, the idea that you can negotiate with someone, and this idea that Putin is some kind of rational actor and, we'll make some kind of business deal with him. Well, that's what the Germans thought for many, many years. I mean, they thought he could be domesticated through these, advantageous market relations. And that didn't work. So the idea that you could, make some kind of real estate deal with him is like, you're looking into this moral abyss. It has to be over. It's a 1945 kind of situation. Like, you couldn't imagine, okay, it's 1943. Like, how about we negotiate with Hitler in such a way that some percentage of the European Jewish population remains under Nazi occupation? Like, that would not have been viable. I feel like this needs to be totally, completely over. There has to be a radical reset, a Stunde Null. And I don't quite understand why the rest of the world hasn't quite come to that position yet.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people in this room completely agree with that. So I wanted to have a question about time, because I think you raised, the perception and kind of nature of time. And you referred to sort of time during the Maidan, which in many ways kind of resembles kind of Mark Meisker's notion of thickened history, where, things change so rapidly. What seems possible one day is, what seems impossible one day is completely possible the next day, or during perestroika, when sort of social structure is almost constantly changing, and kind of hierarchy and the like. So that's like, and I remember when I was in Russia during perestroika, I was at a party meeting, and they decided that they would have shorter terms of office for the party leaders because time was so quick that if they did a year, they would have to do like a month, right? But that was then. But now we're in now, which I'm sure for those on the front lines is quite similar, that nation of time, constant sort of thickened history. But for those of us who are not on the front lines, it often can seem that things aren't changing at all. And it's almost kind of the opposite. And in some ways, I feel like that's kind of demobilizing.
Yeah.
And that's, and this, fits into another question about fatigue, and sort of, and this kind of contributes of, lives are lost, but the basic, borders are more or less the same. I mean, I think there's this perception, which is not entirely wrong, that it's just really hard to see how in the short term this war ends. As long as Putin's alive and as long as Ukrainians remain as courageous as they have been, they're never going to give up Ukraine. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
No, that terrifies me all the time. You think like how much can you expect from people? You know, because people I mean, every time I go back to Ukraine, I'm amazed both by how the human capacity to normalize the abnormal works in two directions, right? It's the source of resilience. You know, people get used to atrocious circumstances and they find a way to work with them. It's also the source of our weakness, because this is like the thing that we thought was totally unacceptable is the new normal 3 months later. And we're like, oh, okay, yeah, there are guys in masks who can show up and take anyone away at any time. Well, we never would have thought we would have accepted that, but, you know, we've gotten used to it. And so that ability, that double-edged sword of the ability to normalize the abnormal. I also see, and this is something I don't understand so well, technically, is that the technology is changing very quickly. And I think that's the thing that is, like, the people I know who are working on the drones, and about, like, what I know about drones is nothing. I mean, very early on, in the first weeks of the war, one of my former research assistants from Crimea, this wonderful, who had worked with me on transcribing interviews, and she sends me this drone proposal. She's like, Marci, can you look over this drone proposal for me? And I'm like, okay, something has gone wrong in the world, because I am not normally your go-to person on the drone proposal. Like, it's like suddenly I'm getting text messages from friends like, can you get us bulletproof vests? Like, I'm not normally the go-to person on the bulletproof vest. Like, But here we are. And so I think that is like, I mean, I was in Kiev last May, June for Operation Spiderweb, which was apparently something on a scale that nobody could have, imagined a year previously, where the Ukrainians planted these, you can probably explain this better than I can. I had it was some kind of extraordinary drone operation planted by the Ukrainians deep inside Russia that hit at some of these launchers way beyond where they were allowed to use Western weapons to get to. And I'm like, there had been an air raid alarm. I was in a bomb shelter. I'm getting all these text messages from friends with like screenshots of Telegram channels, in Ukrainian saying like this hit that and this hit that. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. Like, I'm trying to figure it out. But that apparently was a leap, was something that nobody would have expected would be possible. So I think in that sense, like it feels like there's a stagnation, but I think the technology is changing. And I still wake up every day thinking, like, where is that black swan event? Like, where is that, like, every tyrannical regime eventually falls. But yeah, like, what? Your guess is as good as mine.
Right. Okay, so just to have, I think, one more question, and then we'll, we have food outside, apparently, I hope. Yeah, not alcohol, sadly, but food. So how do you feel, so the question is, do you see signs that the assumption that Russia equals great superior is changing in academia? I mean, I'm not sure that Russia was ever seen as superior, but certainly there's kind of a Russocentric perspective in academia and policy, and I'm just wondering how you see that as being changed by the war.
Yeah, I get that question a lot. I think my perspective could be a little bit skewed, because everyone says, well, Ukraine is derivative of people's interest in Russia. But my own path was very different. Like, Czech was my first Slavic language I learned, and then I learned Polish, and then I learned Russian. And, I got to Ukraine for the first time 20-some years ago because I was following the archival trail of some, Polish poets. And so I came to all this in a very, I came to it from west of Ukraine, but still Eastern Europe and not from Russia. So my perspective was always very different. I never felt like it was particularly derivative from my own experience. I also, I'm very attached to Russian literature. I'm very attached to the Russian language. But I was also skeptical that was really the reason why Russian cruelty was being excused. And I think also this is anecdotal, because so many of my Russianist colleagues, we're talking about, the dozen or two people I know well, or 3 dozen people, so this is not like a statistically significant sample. But I felt like, including people teaching Pushkin and people teaching Tolstoy, were incredibly immediately sensitive to what was going on. One of my colleagues in North Carolina, who her whole career was teaching Russian history and Russian culture and Russian literature. And the first thing she did was try to create spaces for Ukrainian refugees to be accepted by her university. She was using all her Russian skills to help integrate these Russian kids, to do programming, I was just not convinced that it was the people, that it was the people teaching Pushkin who were the Putin apologists. I really felt like the political scientists who were the game theorists, and the Jeffrey Sachses and the John Mearsheimers, and the people for whom this is all a chess match. Very early, the person who teaches Tolstoy at Yale was immediately, Katie Clark, the Russianists were immediately consumed with what we can do for Ukraine. Whereas I gave this talk for a student group at Yale, it must have just been a week or two after February 24th. And they invited me, and they invited the person who teaches Tolstoy, Edita, and they invited this political scientist who works on game theory. Edita came and talked about, literature and, imperialism and visions of X and Y. And I talked about the Maidan and how Ukraine has changed and the relationship to different political cultures, and why I was sure that Ukrainians were not going to be willing to. And the political scientist got up and spoke for half an hour in a talk that was extremely smart, but had absolutely nothing to do with anything. And it was literally like he was analyzing a chess tournament. And there were rules of the game, and there were strategies. There were strategies the way, okay, there are only so many squares on the board, and if you move the pawn this way, then the rook can move that way. And sometimes you have to sacrifice a couple pawns, to get a rook. And I'm like, this is great if you're playing chess, but what happens if you're in the real world and someone walks in and takes a chessboard and throws it at the ceiling and scatters the pieces? This is totally irrelevant. So this idea of we should all behave very rationally because if we just move here, he'll move there. I thought okay, this is not helpful. And I felt like the people who were really preventing more aid from going to Ukraine, I felt like these were actually not the people who were too attached to Tolstoy. I think these were the people who were too attached to this, well, clearly it was NATO, or if only we had moved here. And I'm like, it's not a chess game. I'm all in favor of chess. I take my 15-year-old son to, the chess club at Hart House every Friday afternoon. It's a great exercise. It's a great mental exercise. But, he's 15. He understands that chess is not life. He understands that you can sacrifice some pawns to get a rook, but it's very different if you're talking about actually killing some people. Sorry.
No, that's good. Well, thank you so much. I agree with everything you said. Just one thing, Jeffrey Sachs is not a political scientist. He's an economist. So don't, just to be clear, Okay, on that note, thank you so much. And just one thing, I encourage you to come up to ask her a question, but we have to do so outside.
Eat food.
But also outside because we pay for the room. So just please, if you could just.
If we can move outside.
You could move outside.
Okay.
But,
I'll move outside.
She's very nice. Doesn't mind. So thank you so much.